What's up, guys? This is Jonah Scott. I am a producer, writer, musician, kind of all purpose guy behind the Altogether. And I figured I'd do some videos for you, just showing you this sort of behind the scenes or behind the tracks process of making our new album, which is called Silo. If you haven't checked it out, it's on Bandcamp and Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, everywhere you can get music pretty much. And there has been some interest in me doing these kinds of videos for you, and interests on your end and mine, just because I enjoy doing this stuff and like revisiting what I did. And yeah, it's all kind of contained in my computer anyway, so I figured I'd dive in and show you guys. And what better way to start than with the start of the album? This is track one, on Decatur Street, which is a funky little number. It's really short and sweet, but packs a lot in and has kind of a weird intro and a weird outro, and there's lots of stuff to unfold. So, yeah, if you care to join, just follow along. This is my Pro Tools session. If you aren't familiar with Pro Tools, this is the edit window. That's pretty much 99% of the time what I work out of. There is also the mix window here, which is always there for me, and I know a lot of people manage their plugins and effects and whatnot in the mix window because it does look a little more organized, I guess, in terms of plugins. But I've managed to just sort of adapt to a workflow that commits everything to the edit window. You've got your tracks and comments up here, inserts, 2 columns, sends, 2 columns, and your routing. It works for me because I'm on this iMac and the interface is pretty big. So it's all there for me, is what I'm trying to say. And this is the extent of it. This is all the tracks that went into it. And I figured I'd break it down for you little by little. But first, let's go ahead and play the song. Play the full track so we can all hear it, get caught up. I'll show you guys what happens.
Sunset on Decatur Street. Oh, got the bayou at my feet. It sure was nice to meet you. Don't you go forgetting me. Got me waiting in the river. Got me praying, Lord, forgive her, deliver me. I'm gonna join this family. It sure was nice to meet you. Save some room at the table for me.
Yes. Crazy. Crazy ending. That's the tune. That pretty much goes directly into the next track, Ladybug, and into the next track after that for kind of a 3-song mini medley to open the record. That's the beginning of the album. And Little backstory, I guess, behind the song before we dive into the production and mixing of it is that I wrote it a while ago, I guess, in relative terms, in terms of my career, I guess you could say. I wrote it back in college, right around the time I was writing Sophie, so 2014. It's been a while. And I really envisioned it from the get-go as being something that would open an album. I don't really know why. I just thought, I always knew it was going to be short like that and kind of not a standard form, but rather a riff and a verse and a riff and a verse. And I just thought that was a good way to ease people into a new sound. And I waited till we did our EPs. And then by the time we were planning this LP, I was like, yeah, let's start it with On Decatur Street. And I got around to recording it, and the initial vision of it sort of transformed into something else once I started to add more tracks to it. So that's sort of the fun of it when you are writer, producer, and engineer. All those things start to inform each other, and once you come up with a cool like sound, the composition takes on a slightly new form, and it ended up being really fun. So I guess I should next dive into the sort of distinction between those two things, not writer, but producer and engineer, since those are maybe things that not everyone is familiar with. In this case, both of those roles are me, but they are different. So a producer on a track will sort of inform the creative choices going behind it. So someone comes up with a song and then brings it to a producer who's like, oh, this should have strings on it or whatever. They're sort of choosing the paintbrushes with which you are painting as the sonic painter. The engineer, afterwards, the mix engineer, I should say, is someone who takes all those sounds that have been collected and sculpts them into their most perfect sort of forms, be it with EQ and compression, reverb, adding the sort of technical effects to it that make it pop and make it sound its best. For me, I'm constantly doing both of those things when it comes to my own projects, so it's kind of like a cyclical thing. A production choice will then, a new track, like a new guitar, will become immediately mixed in, at least to some degree, so I can listen to it, and then adding the next thing. It's not like I'm doing one and then the other with a sharp divide in between. So, again, I kind of just did both of those things on this track, and here's what it looks like. We should start with the intro. This intro is kind of funny. It's like not something that I really planned on having in there. In fact, I was sort of doing some production later on the album for See the Day and digging through voice memos on my iPhone, and happened upon this voice memo literally called Entrance to Decatur. I didn't change the title or anything. And it was an idea I had from back in college that was like, me thinking this will be a cool way to bring the song in. This would be a cool little riff that'll start the song off. And someday I'll get around to recording it and I'll add some music, instruments to it and flesh it out in a kind of interesting way. Nope. I just stuck the voice memo in there because I found it and I thought it was neat, and I thought that was all it needed. And I wanted that to signify the kind of humble beginnings of it all. The start of the album starting with literally just a voice memo and then developing into something more slickly produced. So here is that intro, and I've taken all the plugins and effects off just so you can hear the original thing. It sounds like this. You gotta include that little flip. That's how they know. That's how they know it's a voice memo. And so put the effects back on, and it takes on a new sort of form. I think primarily because, initially because it goes from a mono source to a stereo. So when you record on your iPhone, it's just one channel. And then I decided to put this effect rack on it that made it stereo, particularly this Phase Mistress plugin, Stereoizer 3, just straight up preset, worked really well. Into kind of this woozy, like faux stereo kind of thing. You can see it's modulating the signal in this kind of weird way. This, by the way, is Soundtoys Effect Rack, if you can't see that. Gotta be my number one most recommended thing for people getting into audio production and engineering. It is just, this company is amazing. You'll hear me talk about Sound Toys and Plugin Alliance in particular throughout these videos, just because I believe so much in all of their stuff. Universal Audio as well, you can throw in there. Valhalla. Yeah, those four are my main go-tos. And I'm in no way sponsored, but if I were, I assure you I'd talk about them just as much, just because they're that great. So yeah, Sound Toys is here. Plugin Alliance is here with their Brainworks console emulation, and Plugin Alliance again with the Lindell multiband compressor. So it all starts with the SSL 4000G emulation, actually. So in the chain, it goes from top to bottom. And all I'm doing here is filtering out some lows and highs, not really EQing at all. So that's not even in. And I'm compressing. Because I'm compressing a good amount. You can kind of watch it in action. So that really tightens up the sound, both in a dynamic way, you're really compressing it, and in a frequency way, because you're taking out the lows and the highs from there and just leaving kind of the middle stuff. So nothing super revolutionary going on there, but it is worth noting that that's what it starts with. The kind of crazy stuff happens with Sound Toys. Phase Mistress, like I said, is turning it into a stereo signal that sort of, goes back and forth between the ears a little bit. Then I am filtering out some more lows and highs. I'm just giving it a band pass down the middle. Primal Tap and Echo Boy are serving the same function in different ways. They're doing some delays. Primal Tap I mess around with in terms of automation, which you can see down here. And what that means is I'm changing the parameters as the track progresses. So if you look at it, I have decided to instantiate the freeze feature on Primal Tap for like a bar or 2 bars there, and then have it come back out. And basically what that does is that just gives you like infinite feedback, which if I didn't cut it off would literally go on forever. That's how it is. But I thought it was kind of nifty to hear that like last lick that I played echo out up to a point where I no longer wanted it. So it sounds like this. It's freezing now. It freezes off. And that's what causes that feedback. Then Echo Boy is giving it kind of some more just of a spatial reverby type sound. That's the intro. So you can see where it went from old 6-year-old voice memo to that kind of weird little spacey sounding thing that opens up the album. Next up, you'll notice my sessions from top to bottom, or from left to right if you're in the mix window, go basically like this, with percussion and drums at the beginning. Next up, rhythm instruments. This track is only rhythm instruments, really. That's not like there's any saxophones or flutes on there or anything, but things like bass and piano and guitar following. There is an organ here, which may surprise some of you. It's kind of subtle. And then after all the music, it feeds a subgroup called All Music. And then vocals. The exception here being our funky little intro. So that's how it goes, and I'll start from the top. I'll go with the percussion. First thing you'll see is this track called KD, Kick Drum. And, maybe a slight percentage of shame that I feel in admitting that this is a virtual instrument, just because I'm the kind of guy who really likes to record sound sources with a microphone. And especially given that this is a kick drum, it's not like it's some sort of crazy instrument that no one's ever heard of. I would have personally really loved to kick a drum and hold a mic up to it, but I just couldn't do it because of the pandemic, really. I had to just cut a few corners, and this was it's a great plugin from XLN Audio called Addictive Drums, and it has great drum samples on it, and it's just exactly what I needed. So it just sounds like this. You don't need anything else. It's just a 1-in-3 kind of stomper track. I'll get more into this in a second, but you'll notice that kick drum instrument track feeds a subgroup called kick drum, or just kick, which then feeds drums. Drums is down here. Drums feed all music, which is here. All music feeds Stereobus, which is down here. Stereobus feeds the master output. So that's kind of the ultimate chain of where this kick drum is going. The reason why I'm feeding it to just its own bus, it's kind of a weird thing to do if you only have one track. There's almost no need to feed it to a bus. You can just put it at the output. But the reason I do that is because this is actually a mono subgroup. And I call it subgroups. There's also bus or sub mixes, sub masters, those kinds of things you could call it. But I call it subgroups. And I wanted it to be mono. These virtual instruments are all stereo, and a lot of these drum presets have sort of a roominess to them, which is great and makes it realistic. But at the end of the day, I just wanted it to be as if I were miking it with a single mic and coming right down the middle and not worrying about any room tones that wash around the sides. So that's the reason why I'm feeding this stereo track into a mono subgroup. So it just sounds like that. And I have, this is from my sort of, template of Pro Tools sessions that always helps me out. So I do have certain plugins ready to go on it. And again, here comes our effect rack, which is doing 3 different versions of kind of harmonic, interesting, textural tone shaping. So it originates as the drum sample like this. I'm using the preset Wool. I add some harmonic distortion to it, and it sounds like this. So it's really cutting through a lot more now. I'm adding some attack and some, general harmonics to it. Yeah, that's that with the kick. I always find it really interesting to play just the percussion of this track because it's kind of fun. And in fact, I have a whole grouping called D&B for drum and bass just to play that sort of funky backbeat groove. Sometimes that's all you need, But moving on, the snare track, again going out its own mono subgroup, that's part of my template. This time sort of unconventionally panned slightly to the right side. Pro Tools is out of 100, so it's like 22% to the right here. And the reason it felt okay to do that is because this snare drum, which is a genuine audio track of me playing, it's not a traditional snare performance in that I'm not hitting the drum in any way. I'm hitting the side, I'm hitting the rim, so it gets that kind of jingly sound. Just kind of goes throughout the song like that. The most significant thing going on there, I'd say, is the Abbey Road Chambers plugin from Waves. Lots to talk about here. I actually don't normally use a lot of Waves plugins. And I know a lot of people do, but it's not something I usually reach for. But this, I gotta say, this Abbey Road Chambers plugin is awesome. Being a big Beatles nut, I think it's like a really fun effect to put on some things. And in fact, they have this Steed feedback design that they've done really well, which is that effect that you hear on Paperback Writer where the vocals go all crazy. Paperback Writer, rah, 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 rah. That is Steed. So I'm using a little bit of that. I'm using this plugin dominantly as a delay, not a reverb. And another weird thing about it is that I'm using it as an insert. Normally with time-based effects, I'd say 95% of the time I'm using those, delays and reverbs as a parallel send, so that you can send a bunch of different tracks to it and have it kind of give a more cohesive sound and also save on processing power and all that. But in this case, I think what I was doing was I started with the bass. I started it as an insert on the bass, and then was experimenting and not thinking I would ever use it again on the session, and then ended up using it a ton more, so to give it that cohesive sound. And I really should have used it as a parallel send, kind of like I'm doing Verb 2 here. It's just another reverb. I should have done an additional delay send for this Abbey Road Chambers because I used it all over the session, and you'll see that. But that's the general gist of the snare track. It's cool, and I think it really gets is helped by that, delay from the Abbey Road chamber. Because without it, totally different. And this is going to happen, I think, from time to time. I seem to need a good amount more RAM. I will be on the streets begging for RAM one of these days, but for now this will have to do. So sorry about that if that comes up. Yeah, and I think that just like in general, that plugin and the way that it gives that slapback kind of sound is great for the 60s, early 70s sound that I was chasing for this track. Some other kind of more standard stuff going on with shaker and tambourine. You'll notice I actually performed tambourine. I played tambourine throughout the track and then decided to mute it until the second verse just to give it a little lift. That was a production decision. That was like, sometimes when you've got a song that repeats, it's good to introduce a new element in the second verse or something so that way it sounds like it's constantly evolving. So that's a pretty common thing to do, and I did that with tambourine in this case, with the exception of this fun little rattlesnake maneuver. And that shows up right in the middle of the song where that riff comes back in. Oh yeah. And then there's a group of claps, 3 tracks of it. It's really just me clapping. Interesting to note is that I find oftentimes that, clapping relatively closely into a mic is not always like a satisfying sound. It's really peaky and short and a lot of highs in there that aren't necessarily like what you think of claps sounding like. So I sort of put a bandana in lieu of a glove. I put a bandana over my like stationary hand and then slapped it with my other hand, also known as clapping. And that kind of muffled the sound just to the degree that I wanted it to. And I just kept doing that over and over until I had enough to stack 3 tracks of it. And so it sounds like 3 people clapping. Panning them out middle, left, and right, but then feeding, again, its own stereo claps subgroup that itself is only panned from 54 to 6 on the left side. So it sounds like this. And if you remember what that snare track sounded like, you will definitely recognize the sound of the slapback from the Abbey Road chambers. Again, should have just used a parallel send, but it's too late now. Coulda, shoulda, woulda. So, and I think panning those to the left, was a decision that was made by, it's good to kind of give these things their own space. And I wasn't necessarily going for the most modern sound on this track. I was kind of going for a vintage, Beatles or Bridge Over Troubled Water kind of tone. So yeah, they're off to the left and the snare's off to the right, and I think that balances nicely. All those percussion elements feed a drum subgroup, which is being compressed and given some more harmonic saturation. This is a cool plugin from Plugin Alliance, black box analog design HG2 for harmonic stuff. Moving down, we got the bass, which is kind of personally my favorite part of the song. I guess because when I wrote this, I was envisioning a smoother Crosby, Stills, Nash kind of 3-part beautiful song. And then, I was playing along to it and realizing the chord changes are a little swampy and funky, and it deserved a swampy, funky bass treatment. So I started playing along, and the first thing that I should talk about is that the comments here on the left are actually comments of me, the way that I was recording this through my Universal Audio Apollo interface, and I was using plugins on the interface to directly commit to. So it was almost as if I'm playing through a virtual version of the Manley Vox box and into the 1176 compressor. So those things are committed off the bat, and you'll see that even without plugins, I do have kind of the tone that I was looking for and the tone that I ended up with. Whoops. Well, that's just horrible. Oh, come on. Okay, guys, that was not great. And I apologize for this ridiculousness. But anyway, I got the tone before even, deciding on plugins, and then later I saturated it some more, put it through the Abbey Road chambers, and sculpted the kind of frequencies of it. Again, Abbey Road chambers, and this I'm going to just talk about again only because it's a kind of unconventional thing to put on bass, reverb, or delay when it comes to a traditional bass line. But I wanted it to have that slapback sound, and this bass in this song, even though it is really low and boomy in some ways, it's also like a guitar part. It's got that sort of bite that comes from electric guitar. So yeah, again, unconventional, but I decided to go with it, and I think it really benefits from that. Electric Guitar 2 here, as opposed to Electric Guitar 1, is interesting. It's really low in the mix and isn't like a dominant player in the song itself, but it is there to sort of thicken the bass line. So it starts coming in where the acoustic does, the kind of big deal acoustic part, and then proceeds to match the bass line. So I'll play these two at the same time because you'll hear it slightly in the left ear, this electric guitar pattern. And again, Abbey Road chambers as an insert. Shouldn't have done it, but I did it. Well, I shouldn't have done it as an insert, but you guys know the story by now. So that's the electric guitar part. The star of the show, at least instrumentally, is this acoustic guitar. And it's the first thing I did. And it was one of those rare instances where you'll see there's no cuts here. And in fact, it's like, ST6901_3, which means it was the third take. And I'm sure even those first two were like false starts because as I remember it, this is like a one-take wonder kind of situation. And that's super rare for me. I get really picky about, what I should be doing better as I progress through the takes. But I just kind of sat down and played it, and that was it. So that was a really good way to start off the session and made me feel good about how it was going. But yeah, it is my Gibson B25 guitar. This thing is interesting. As I understand it, I think it used to be like almost a kid's or a starter guitar because it is a small body acoustic. But the thing's like twice as old as I am. It's from 1970. So it's got a lot of character and a lot of twang, and it's not something that you would use on every song. It does have its own sort of, it's not a universal acoustic guitar sound. But for this one, I thought it was perfect and gave it that sort of southern twang that I thought was fitting. It's 2 tracks of the same performance because what I did was I mic'd it with my, I mic'd it with my Sterling ST69 tube mic, really great affordable tube mic. And I also DI'd it because I put a pickup in there. So that enabled me to sort of split out the sound and deal with the frequencies in a way that was, kind of one at a time. So here's how the mic sounds. Really thin and not necessarily something that you would want to hear on its own, but conversely the DI sounds like this to give it that low body. So the two of them together make a full acoustic sound. And that DI is interesting. On its own, it doesn't sound like that. Obviously, I'm using effects there, but it sounds like this. A pretty typical DI sound. Pretty sterile, but something that you could work with and really turn into something. So I'm bringing it back through that, SSL console, rolling off a lot of highs there, as you can see. Effect rack, as always, giving it some saturation and some tone sculpting with some more EQ. Similar things happening up here where I'm rolling off a good amount of lows on the mic end. Probably saturating it too, if I had to guess. Yep, just a little bit with Decapitator. And that's how it goes. These are both, as is typical for me, these are both feeding a subgroup called Gibson Sub, and that lets me treat both of those tracks as one thing, and again, lots of more effects happening on there with a reverb send to Verb 1, which is Soundtoy's little plate. Yep. And pushing it off slightly to the right so that it just has its own space and it's not taking up the entire stereo field. Additionally, we have this cute little track called Lewis Acoustic, so named because I borrowed it from my coworker Lewis. And I just, I don't know, I enjoy any opportunity to use a different instrument or something that's not, that I've never used before, and just let it breathe its own life into the track. So this acoustic guitar is pushed off to the left a little bit and comes in when the full band comes in at marker 2 here. So the two of them together sound like this. So I think it's generally a good idea as a producer sometimes with acoustic music like this. It's a good idea to sometimes add a guitar in there that's not necessarily fulfilling any role besides percussive. So this track is almost really just like a drum track because it's not adding a ton of harmonic. I am playing the chords, but it's not like it's beefing up the tone of the song. It's just adding that little sizzle in the left ear, the same way kind of a shaker would. Without it, not really as interesting. So it plays a huge role, even though it's not like contributing the most sonically. I really like the way it sounds there, though. Both Gibson Subgroup and Lewis Acoustic feed all acoustics, and then I get to EQ those. Wouldn't you know? This, by the way, is the amazing Universal Audio Pultec emulation, the EQ-P1A. This is just a classic EQ design. It's a little funky to look at. You don't necessarily know what you're looking at the first time you see it, but it is used everywhere, and it's kind of one of the most sought-after EQs in the real world. So it's great to have an emulation. Most of the plugins that I use are in some way an emulation of a real hardware thing, and this is no exception. Following that, we only have two more instrument tracks. One of them is an electric guitar. Much like the Tambourine, it comes in halfway through the song, even though I played it throughout, and I just decided, no, let's mute it at the first part and then bring it in the second half. And you'll hear that kind of way off to the left when that second verse comes in, because it adds that bite in the left ear. Oh yeah. So same kind of thing. I think it's almost directly playing the same thing as the main acoustic guitar, but it's electric, so it gives its own sound, and you can see there's it's a lot beefier of a sound, a lot more saturated. And I'm just sculpting it with the again, SSL 4000G. Got to be consistent. This low pass filter is something that I use all the time on electric guitars, and it took me a while to learn that about electric guitars, but you can really carve out everything above 4K in an electric guitar like 90% of the time. You don't need the stuff above 4K, even 3K usually for me, but it just depends. Electric guitar is a lot more of a mid-range instrument than it is a high-end instrument. So acoustic guitar, it'd be a pretty rare thing to filter out things above 4K the way I do with electric. But electric is just like, you leave that stuff in, it just becomes too harsh. So if I were to leave it in and take this LPF off, too much bite. That's exactly where it needs to sit. So it's, definitely worth checking that out for your electric guitar tracks if you are into doing this stuff like I am. And then there's an organ. Like I said, it's a bit sneaky, but it is there. And it has this great like ballpark sound to it. It is frozen right now just because I wanted I wanted my computer to not freak out as much as it actually has been. The instrument is a virtual instrument, which really helps someone like me who's not the best organ player in the world. If I wanted to, I could just sort of tweak the MIDI a little bit and make it a little bit of a better performance. Not to say I did that, but I could do it. That is the Arturia emulation of a Hammond B3 organ, classic. And then two huge surprises going on here is that I'm going into the SSLG console and then effect rack. Who'd have thunk? Again, making great use of these filters here. It doesn't look like I'm compressing, but I am slightly EQing. And just making it sound its best. Here's what it sounds like. It's basically following the melody. So an instrument like that is, a sustained instrument, so it just sort of sits underneath everything and boosts the general kind of harmony and melody up throughout the track and just sits underneath as a bed. So I think it really, you may not notice it, but it plays a big role. And again, I'm bringing it down 11.1 dB volume-wise. So it's tucked in, but it's nice. And that brings us to vocals next, sort of the real star of the track, as with most music, I would say. And this is straight up 3 tracks for 3 vocalists. From its inception, this song was a 3-part track. So I wrote the melody knowing that I wanted stuff stacked on top of it. And in this particular key, it works that I'm singing the melody and Brian and Sierra are singing the harmonies. And so, I tracked myself first. I say tracked. That's it means to record, tracking. Then Brian, then Sierra. Normally, if I was just mixing this and maybe it was another band of people that I didn't know their names or anything, I would rename these tracks. But this is just part of my template to call it LV for lead vocal. But that being said, this is my song, my session, and I know what's what. So in case there was any confusion, I put comments in for J, B, and S. Edwina is the mic name for Sierra, the Ear Trumpet Labs Edwina, which is kind of my go-to for her. And that's basically how it went. It's interesting. You will see a bit of a patchwork quilt here of colors. For what it is different takes. So I'm running one take into another, into another, into another. And the reason I did that like this was because I decided from very early on that this whole album was not going to have any vocal tuning on it, be it Melodyne or auto-tune or any of that stuff, which is more commonplace in the industry than you might expect. It's not like we all are trying to be T-Pain with the kind of effect of it, but auto-tune and Melodyne are both used all across the board with isolated vocals. And I just wanted to avoid that this time around. For my job, I do a lot of that stuff, and it got kind of tedious, and it's like I'd really prefer to just get a really good performance and kind of leave it in as it was, flaws and all, and have it be really believable and authentic. So that's what we set out for, and it ended up coming true and being a good deal of fun throughout the album. So every time you see a color change on one of these tracks, it's because I'm using a different take. And that's an interesting part of this process. You can get away with a lot more than you kind of expect when you're first starting out. So if I want to be a little bit masochistic and play you my isolated vocal take, you will see that these vocal breaks or these splices kind of happen at places you might not expect.
I still feel it in my chest, the rhythm of sunset on Decatur Street. Oh, I've got the bayou at my feet. Well, it sure was nice to meet you. Don't you go forgetting me.
So, again, no tuning on that, which is a tall order for a singer like me because it's tough, but it did happen. But yeah, I just want to focus on some of these splices. rhythm of, I think is what this is. You don't necessarily expect it to be two different takes, but basically here's that M in rhythm, and then of starts in the next take, and it blends pretty seamlessly.
The rhythm of sunset on.
And you wouldn't really know it, which is, at least I don't think you would. If you noticed it, let me know, because that's a pretty good ear. But yeah, a lot of that happens throughout this where you wouldn't necessarily know it. Here it is, Decatur Street, and you have S in street here, and then treat comes from another take. So it's take 10 into take 7, and it goes like this.
On Decatur Street.
I mean, no one's noticing that. That's like, completely seamless as far as I'm concerned. S's are pretty easy to identify. Once you do a lot of vocal recording and mixing, you can see like that's an S right there because it looks like a big fuzzy caterpillar. Whereas the rest of these kind of more tonal sounds have these satisfying waveforms to them. And we just go throughout. There's a bit of this happening too. You can kind of tell from the color that this is actually all the same take here, but what I did is I crossfaded it into itself, and the reason I did that is because of these clip gain changes, which you can see at the bottom left of the waveform here. I decided to bring up the clip gain a good amount, 4.1 dB, and then crossfade it into the same clip at just 1 dB up and then 1.9 dB up, just to flatten it out a little bit more. It's kind of a manual way of compressing. I didn't do any volume automation because that's a slightly different thing. What that is taking the output of a track and adjusting the volume, like with these faders over here. But no, I was at 2.4. And I didn't do any of that. I just did clip gain adjustments. And that is a different thing because it actually affects how you're feeding your plugins. It's not adjusting the output of your plugins, it's adjusting the input. So you're feeding the compressors more. I think just because the music demanded that I bring that phrase up a little bit, it sounds like this.
To meet you, don't you go forgetting me.
So when I go sing Don't You, it's louder than the originally recorded material just because it's a lower note, and I think I had to bring it up some more. That stuff happens kind of over here too. And then there's Brian and Sierra. Brian being 16% off to the left and Sierra 16 to the right. So it's a tight little 3-part harmony in terms of the stereo field. It's not like we're panning them out hard to the left and right. But together, we sound like this. Nice little acapella treat for you.
Oh, I still feel it in my chest. The rhythm of sunset on Decatur Street. Oh, I've got the bayou at my feet. Well, it sure was nice to meet you. Don't you go forgetting me.
Oh yeah, buttery. I am using a lot of the same plugins that we've seen. This Lindell multi-band compressor just is a compressor that addresses bands, frequency bands, low, mid, and high, with parameters that you set yourself. And for me, my vocal, I am only using the low and mid bands because I didn't want to touch the high end. I just wanted to tame the kind of, low stuff just because I have a low voice. That goes into the Brainworks SSLG console. Look at that. Doing a bit of EQ and some filtering, and that's kind of it. I'm being mostly subtle with this guy. It's just showing up all over the session because I wanted to pretend that I was using an SSL console for this track, when in reality this is all just happening in my computer. Next up is Brian's track, which I went with something different here. And I think the reason for that is, it's not like a great reason, but if I recall, it is because I just downloaded this plugin, just bought it, and wanted to test it out. So it's really accomplishing the same thing. You can see it looks different. This is an emulation of a Neve console. This is SSL. So they're going to give their different sounds to it, but at the end of the day, it's just EQ and compression and gates and all that same stuff. So I just wanted to test it on Brian because I recorded him at a different time and had just gotten this plugin and wanted to see how it worked. And surprise, surprise, it works really well. I'm adding a good amount of high end as a shelf above like 12K or 13 or so. Cutting some of the mid-range and lower stuff so that's not too boomy and sort of interfering with the music too much. And I am, it seems, compressing it a little bit with at a very low ratio. And that's these 4 knobs are the main compressor circuit. And that's how the Neve looks. It's really cool. And filtering out some lows because why would you ever need below 121 on a vocal like that? Sierra as well. Again, Lindell 354, SSLG, and some dynamic EQ. It seems like she might have just been a little too bright, a little too sibilant maybe. So everything above 7,500 hertz gets dynamically sort of EQ'd out. You can see that work as we go through it.
Chest, the rhythm of sunset on Decatur Street.
I think the reason I did that was just so that it didn't take away from the melody and didn't poke out too much in terms of the 3 of us. These 3 vocal tracks all feed a lead vocal subgroup. Again, I'm processing them individually so we can address each singer's needs tonally, but then they're all feeding the subgroup where everything gets bussed together and processed as one. So de-essing, because sometimes you gotta. SSLG, the Lindell 254E, which is a more standard compressor, just one band across the board, acting in fast mode at 2-to-1. And the Pultec Pro, and this is great because it kind of comes with comes with any, I think, Universal Audio Apollo interface, and it's a combination of the two of the Pultec designs, the EQP1A and the MEQ5. So this is for lows and highs, and this is for mids. And what I'm doing here is giving it a good healthy dip at 300, just to take away those kind of fundamental booms of the vocal, lines. Then adding some sparkle up top at 8K, and boosting and attenuating 100, which is an interesting trick that I can't really describe because it's not the same shape, these 2 boosts and the cuts. But yeah, that's kind of the last part of the vocal chain. And I guess I also wanted to show you guys an insight into my vocal tracking workflow, which is that these are kind of LV1 and 2 and 3, and there's even more in my template. But those are sort of used to drag good takes down into, whereas I use LV tracking, lead vocal tracking, as a sort of playlisting track. So if you look at the playlist, which is what Pro Tools calls it, it's where I'm saving all the different takes. And they're kind of out of order, but if you start at 1, this is where I started recording myself. Next up was Brian, who's up here. You can see all the takes I did of him. And then Sierra at the end. And I have so many takes. There's like 77 in here, I think it said, or more. I did so many takes specifically because I knew that I wanted to not do any vocal tuning for this project, like I said. So you might as well just get the best out of your performers when you do that. And then there's just a few more buses that reach us to the end of our session here. Each, this lead vocal kind of master lead vocal subgroup branches off and feeds different effects sends. So, and that's part of my template too. LV Verb is lead vocal reverb, and it has different options of my kind of most used reverbs. And look, I'm using Abbey Road Chambers, but this time it's different because I have the it is as a send and not an insert, which is again preferable. But I have the reverb blend mixed in so that it's acting more of as a reverb and a delay at the same time. Whereas before, when we saw it in this track, it was just kind of being used as a delay. I have lead vocal saturation, which is Soundtoys, Decapitator, classic. I use Effect Rack sort of instinctively whenever I want a Soundtoys plugin, even if it's just the one, just because I know there's always I always have the ability to add another Soundtoys plugin in the space of one insert, so that's great. But in this case, I'm just using the decapitator in end mode, and I forget what hardware that's modeled after, but it's something cool. And I'm driving it so that it gives the vocals a distortion that's definitely there, but subtle because it's in parallel. And I'm only feeding it so much. I'm feeding it at like 15 dB down. So it's not going to overwhelm you. And like I said, decapitator can be used subtly. It can be used not subtly, but on most vocal cases, it's just used as something to slightly color the sound and give it a little bit of grit that cuts through the rest of the mix. I'm also sending it to LV Width, which is name is pretty self-explanatory, but it is a microshift this time, which is modeled after some cool, interesting delay sort of plugins that were, analog hardware that were designed specifically for the purpose of taking a mono signal and branching it out into stereo using subtle delays and detuning. So I'm doing that. I know this is a 3-part harmony where things are spread out, but I'm still using the microshift on it because it kind of smears the image in a kind of cool way. So without it, they sound like this.
Oh, I still feel it in my chest. The rhythm of sunset on Decatur Street.
So it somehow does add a little width to it. I guess particularly because the plugin is panned 100% to the left and right. So it widens us, but not to the point that we sound like we're in separate spaces. So I really like that. Again, part of my template. And all these 4 things feed all vocals, which is just a collection of all the vocals. And I do this, I don't know if I've seen anyone do this, but I think it just makes sense to me, is that I am limiting the entire vocal bus, reverbs and everything. That way it just tightens up everything a slight amount. When I play it, you'll see that the peak reduction is going down very little, so it's like I'm barely compressing it at all, but it is happening and it adds some color to the sound.
Oh, I still feel it in my chest.
So that first notch there is for 1 dB, and I'm not even doing that much. I'm doing like less than half a dB. But it's happening, and I tend to like how it sounds, and it just lifts up the vocals throughout the mix. So that's something I generally do to all my vocal mixes. And that really brings us to the end almost. The next track you'll see after that is called Track Verb. It's kind of a relic of my recording template. It actually stands for tracking reverb, and it's something that I throw in for like singers, for just to hear along as they sing. They can hear some nice reverb, and this is Valhalla Room, really great company that makes really affordable time-based effects. And I have it on the Dark Chamber preset, but this is actually a super interesting case of it because you'll see all music in the entirety of the instruments are feeding track verb a little bit, 20 dB down. So really subtly, not too much going on, but it's kind of a weird thing to do. It's not something that you would do in a mix scenario most often, but I just decided I wanted this track to sound a little bit more like it was all coming from one room with a bunch of people playing in it. And that's obviously not the case. Each of these instruments was played by me one at a time in this small room. So I fed the all music subgroup to a track verb, which is just giving it a little bit of roominess and a little bit of space, again, for that old school sound. And then everything under the sun here, with the exception of entrance to Decatur, is then feeding Stereobus, the single most important track in this session. And it's going to look similar across all my mixes because, again, it's part of my template, and it's just something that I do no matter what I'm doing in Pro Tools. You may wonder why I'm not feeding just the master fader, because you could do that. I mean, it's just essentially acting as a sub-master. But the reason is because if you were to, say, have a compressor, like a mix bus compressor on your master plugin, it's not pre-fader. So that means, wait, is that? It is not pre-fader. I get these terms mixed up so often. But basically, if you were to slap a compressor on your master bus and then bring the volume down, it would then be hitting the compressor less, which is not something that I want. So I do it with an aux send that then feeds the master. What do we got here? We got CQ from Sound Toys. It is the Bus Magic preset that I've tweaked. So it's not, it's not the initial Bus Magic preset, but it's a really simple and musical sounding EQ. I recommend in general that if you're starting out with this stuff, with your plugins, you take a look at presets because they're generally made by smart people who know what they're talking about. But then you kind of take what they give you and tweak it and mold it to your needs, because you don't want to be stuck in preset mode and not knowing how to actually work these plugins. So that's kind of what I did. Bus Magic is a really good, mix bus EQ preset, but I had to tweak a little bit to bring that more of the mids up. Then following that is our good friend, SSL Console. I am cutting a little bit of that low mud range, less than a dB down there. Black Box Saturator, which is just giving the entire track some grit. The Waves API 2500, a super popular, really nice sounding mix bus compressor. If I had the money, I would be using the Universal Audio emulation of it, just because all their plugins are amazing. But in a pinch, this Waves will do just fine. Following that is the Lindell 354 again, which has its own mix bus presets. And to be honest, I don't know if I think I changed this one a little bit from the mix bus smooth preset, but probably not all that much. Brought the master gain down a little bit, and that just kind of, again, addresses each band individually and gives the track a little more thickness. And then the secret sauce of the mix bus, I gotta say, this thing might look a little tiny to you guys, and I apologize for that, but this is a great plugin for saturation. So it's doing a similar thing to what the Black Box is doing, but in a different way, because I gave you that whole spiel on using presets and plugins, and proceeded to break the rule because this is straight up just the MS Master preset. And that's because I haven't found a better way to do what this preset does. But basically, if you slap this on your mix bus, it will bring the track to life in a stereo kind of way, and process it in a mid-side fashion that just really electrifies the kind of left-right. It really just widens the track in a really neat way. So I'm going to actually play this first verse for you and toggle the MS Master on the Vertigo VSM3 here, and you can pretty much notice the difference if you're wearing headphones.
Oh, I still feel it in my chest.
Whoops. Well, I toggled it once there. When it turns blue, it's out. And you can just hear it get thinner and kind of less chunky. And once it's in, it just sounds so much fuller. There is probably a slight volume, jump in volume, which isn't exactly fair test, but the thing does wonders for your stereo field, and I just throw it at the end of my mix bus chain all the time. It's awesome. And rounding it out with some EQ at the end. So I did end up dipping some 700 despite boosting it here. So maybe that was redundant and stupid of me, but I think it sounds fine. And that is the end of my sort of mixing. I suppose the last thing to address is that crazy ending, because it has its own weird stuff going on. You can see the automation that's happening in there. And that is this guy, the effect rack, with a kind of distorty preset of Echo Boy that really just feeds itself back and gets real nasty, that I'm then EQing, actually not EQing at all, just giving it some more drive with the CQ. And that gets automated in, so throughout the track it lies dormant, ready to strike. And then at the end, when things go crazy, it starts to mix in to the point where it gets feedbacky and real nasty, which I really liked. And then that final sound of the distortion of the sort of white noise is the recycle knob on this effect rack. So you'll see it go up when that starts to go up. Whoa. And recycle is a feature in the Soundtoys Effect Rack that's essentially a feedback mechanism. I don't know exactly what it's doing, but you give it a little bit of juice like that and it goes crazy. So I then kind of just have it run till the track is done, and I always intended to have that cut off right at the moment that the snare hits for Ladybug, and then go into the nice sort of pleasant, jaunty Ladybug mix for that juxtaposition. Um, so that about does it for us here. Um, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. If not, then I just got to talk about it again, which is always fun. And I'm planning on doing more of these, so stay tuned for those. But yeah, if you guys are interested in getting into production and mixing, I hope that you're able to look at this and maybe get some ideas of what you want to do with your next project. And hopefully you're also able to see that I'm not using like a ton of different plugins. This all can be done with a decent, decently modest budget, I'd say. But I'm always spending money on these things and looking for new gear, so it's kind of both at the same time. But yeah, it's just a matter of layering your sounds and layering your effects and sculpting till you're happy. So thanks a lot for watching. Thanks even more for listening and being interested in our music. And I can't wait to give you guys some more. So till next time, signing off.